Good afternoon. Welcome to part 2 of chapter 2 of the Troy SCISA Political Science 2241. I'm going to be starting on page 41, and if you'd follow along with me in your books, we're going to talk about the Constitution created both bold powers and sharp limits to power. We can see that by the checks and balances that the founders and framers of the Constitution put in place, checks and balances that we'll go over a little bit later on, but those checks and balances occur over each branch: the legislative over the executive over the judicial over the executive and legislative as well. So all different branches of government had all different types of checks. We'll go over those somewhere later on in this lecture today. Also, the Electoral College. The Electoral College was the presidential electors for each state who met the popular election vote ballots cast for president and vice president. You come up with the Electoral College numbers for each state. Say South Carolina, for instance, has 7 congressional districts, and we have 2 senators. Therefore, when you add the number of congressional districts plus the number of senators, you get, of course, 9 electoral votes. That's very important because you have to have 270 plus votes to win the Electoral College in any presidential election. Those electors come together in the 1st of December to cast their votes formally, and that's actually when our formal vote for president occurs. So really, yes, you're voting for a presidential candidate and vice president, but you're actually voting for electors to vote for you. And then, of course, the Bill of Rights limits power in our government too. It tells us basically those 10 amendments to the Constitution give us liberties that the government cannot take away from us. We've already talked about those, and I would appreciate if you would go back in your lecture notes and also look on our PowerPoints to see those particular Bill of Rights, the 10 Bill of Rights. On page 42 and 43, we'll talk specifically about the 7 articles of the Constitution. The first article, the legislative branch, it goes on to tell you about House terms, Senate terms, qualifications, those types of things. That's very important. It tells you about certain types of powers, express powers that are written into the Constitution, delegated powers that are given to the states, and of course the people of the states. Then you have reserve powers, and you also have concurrent powers, which are powers that are shared by the state and the national government. You should go and review those terms as well. I will a little later on in the chapter as well. Then, of course, the second article is the executive branch. That's our presidency and bureaucracy. And it goes on to talk about term limits. You have the president can serve 4-year terms, of course. He's limited to 2 consecutive terms and 2 terms in general, much less consecutive. The third article deals with the judicial branch, the United States Supreme Court, and of course the federal court system. You need to know what court packing is, a scheme back during the 30s to add more Supreme Court justices to the court because FDR's New Deal was not getting passed through adequately, and a lot of the decisions were going not in the favor of FDR, and they were going by 5-4 votes. So there was a scheme at some point by a senator from Texas, if I'm not mistaken, to push that forward. So every senator or every Supreme Court justice was over 70 or either 75 would be replaced by a new one. This scared the Supreme Court, and many of those decisions started going the other way in FDR's and the New Deal's favor. But again, the power of the government over these 3 areas, Article 1, the legislative branch, Article 2, the executive branch, Article 3, the judicial branch. Article 4 deals with, of course, national unity and power. The states and how they are established in each one, giving each state full faith and credit in the other states and the acts and laws of the other states. And of course, it guarantees citizens of any state to have privilege and immunities of every state. So in other words, when you go across the state line from South Carolina to North Carolina and Georgia, your license is still intact. Or if you own property in one state, even though you move to another, you still own that property. And of course, the 5th article deals with amending the Constitution. We're going to talk about that in just a few moments. How to amend the Constitution. It does require 2/3 of Congress and the adoption by 3/4 of the states. We'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. And of course, the 6th article deals with national supremacy, that the laws of the United States, the federal government, supersede those of the state governments. And then, of course, the ratification process. And I must tell you that it needed 9 states to be approved. And that goes along with the Articles of Confederation. So you can see the framers of the Constitution tried to marry some pieces of the Articles of Confederation and the ratification process with the, of course, new Constitution. We'll talk about that. Now on page 43, I want to talk about the legislative branch was designed to be the most powerful. I think it's important that you understand that. The framers of the Constitution knew if they had an overly abundantly strong executive, it would be trouble. It would be more like a monarchy, and people were scared. They'd just gotten out of a monarchy with Great Britain. They were scared to go back. So again, the legislative branch was designed to be the most powerful. We've had ebbs and flows in our governmental system, in which the president has been more powerful at times, and Congress would take back its power, and then the president would force its way back in, and Congress would take its power back. And that's happened in several events, in several occasions. You can see there was a strong presidency in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, of Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, FDR, and Congress in those particular cases would take back some power by different rulings and different ways procedurally they could do that. So again, that's very important to understand. I think it's important that you know what the elastic clause is from Article 1, Section 8. It basically, and it's sometimes known as the necessary and proper clause, because it provides the Constitution and Congress with the authority to make laws necessary and proper to carry out the powers of Congress. I think that's really important. You know, we can't have a law for everything, and the designers and framers of the Constitution recognize that. So therefore, what they did was they decided that they would put in a clause within the Constitution to ensure that other particular areas of the Constitution and government would work, although they weren't actually written into the Constitution. Again, the elastic clause, otherwise known as the necessary and proper clause. The executive branch created brand new offices, and it certainly did. And in the departments, we had Department of Defense, which was originally known as the Department of War, Department of State, which has a Secretary of State, Department of the Treasury. And it's important that you know that the President of the United States has power to select those secretaries and those individuals who work in those departments. There is something called the spoil system, which does protect some of the lower workers in those departments from every time there is a change in administrations by the presidency, that there are changes. But there's some protections there because of the spoil system that we'll talk about in later chapters. And then, of course, I did want to talk about the judicial branch was a check on too much democracy. You know, sometimes we recognize that the will of the people sometimes pushes agendas in Congress, and the judicial branch was put in place to make sure, almost like an umpire, to make sure that rights weren't trodden upon, the rights listed in the Constitution. And you have two different types of interpretation. You have broad interpretation, which is really a more liberal view, and strict interpretation of the Constitution. Then, of course, judicial review came in by the court case Marbury versus Madison. Judicial review was a very relevant and new idea of our Constitution. It was one in which the justices could deem a law that was passed by Congress, both houses, and signed by the president, or either overridden, would be a possibility that the Supreme Court could overrule it. And that's a uniquely American principle that occurs. That's now in many countries around the world today. I do think it's important that we talk about the supremacy clause, which is in Article 6, which basically says that the laws of the United States are supreme over state laws. We do have, in our country today, we do have a constant fight between states' rights and, of course, the national government. And I think it's important that we know that as well. And the supremacy clause basically states that to ensure that states understand that the national laws, the federal laws, are superseding and have to be followed more so than state laws. I think it's important that we talk about the nullification acts that occurred by South Carolina's John C. Calhoun during the early half of the 1800s. And the Supreme Court, of course, ruled that states, because of Article 6, could not nullify laws by the federal government. And of course, the Constitution also establishes due process. Due process in Article 5 is so very important. That is one of our bedrock principles, that everyone has certain rights under when you're accused of a crime. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward as well. Now, I do want to talk about our own separations of powers on page 46 and 47. As you can look, separations of powers on page 47, there's a great graphic there, figure 2.1. The legislative branch, of course, passes federal laws, controls federal appropriations. And by the way, all appropriations dealing with taxes must originate in the House, not the Senate, the House. Regulates interstate commerce, establishes lower court systems. The executive branch enforces the laws. It has a commander-in-chief of the armed forces. It makes foreign treaties, proposes laws, appoints Supreme Court justices and federal court judges, and pardons those convicted in the federal court system. And you can see a lot of these separation of powers also lead to our checks and balances. The judicial branch reviews lower court decisions, decides constitutionality of laws, and of course decides cases involving disputes between states. That's something that's really important as we talk about the constitutional limits of government and separation of power. Federalism, which is radically different than what our Articles of Confederation was. Federalism was a step towards greater centralization of power, putting the power in the hands of the centralized government, we would call that in Washington, D.C. today, versus the state governments, which is more like a confederate form of government. And then, of course, the Bill of Rights. You've heard me say this before, that had it not been for a promise of a Bill of Rights, then we would not have the United States Constitution today. Because many people within the Continental Congress, or not Continental Congress, I'm sorry, the Constitutional Convention, believe very strongly that they did not want to have an all-powerful centralized government because they feared what had happened during British colonial rule. Now, if you look on page 48 and 49, you'll see some absolutely great graphics in figure 2.2 and table 2.1. You'll see that the executive over the legislative power carry out acts of Congress, or can veto acts of Congress. That's one thing that the executive branch can do over the legislative branch. The legislative branch over the judicial branch can change size of the court when it deems necessary, and judicial over executive branch can declare executive orders unconstitutional. I would certainly suggest looking, because there are many different checks and balances I think you need to be aware of on page 48. On 49, it talks about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. We know Federalists were those that were in favor of the support of the ratification of the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists were against it. And I think you should look and see that the Federalists, who they were property owners, creditors, and merchants. Anti-Federalists were generally small farmers, frontiersmen, debtors, and shopkeepers. And you can see what they believed. From the Federalists, feared excessive democracy. Anti-Federalists wanted to make sure that the concentration of power wasn't in the elites. You can read on that as well. I think there's important enough information there on page 49 that you need to read that. The Federalist Papers, which were put in place by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, were a different group of papers that were written and published in newspapers around the United States to try to push people to be in favor of ratification of this new governing document we know as the United States Constitution. We talk about tyranny of the majority, where majority rule and minority rights are important. We talk about representation, how we would be represented in each House of Congress. The House being 2-year terms, voted on by the people, and the Senate originally being, of course, voted on by state legislatures, now voted on by the people in a populist type of amendment that occurred in the Constitution as well. Looking on page 50, 52 and 53, a constitutional amendments dramatically change the relationship between citizens and governments. I think it's important that we know what amendments are. Those are changes in the Constitution. And you can see that there are, on page 53, there are 4 ways the Constitution can be amended. I'm going to read those real quick because it's not really confusing. You just need to understand how it works. First is by 2/3 vote, a passage in the House and Senate by 2/3 vote of a proposal to move forward to have a constitutional amendment. And the second way to do it is proposal by a national convention called by Congress in response to petitions from 2/3 of the states. So you can see you have that good fraction, 2/3 for proposals. Then for ratification of either or, you would have to have the acceptance of the majority vote in the legislatures of 3/4 of the states. Or you could have acceptance by conventions called for the purpose of 3/4 of the states and ratified in 3/4 of the states. So what you see is you have a proposal phase, which can either be done by Congress or it can be done by convention, and it has to have 2/3 votes of Congress to be able to move forward there. Or you have to have, and for the ratification process, 3/4 of the states have to ratify it by state legislatures, or if they're accepted by conventions, 3/4 of the states have to ratify it at a convention that's called. Now, really only I think all but one of our amendments, 27 amendments to the Constitution, have been ratified by the passage of House and Senate by 2/3 votes, and then of course majority votes in state legislatures by 3/4 of the states, which would be 38 states would have to approve it. You can read about that on page 52 and 53. And then I think it's important enough that everyone looks and sees what our amendments to the Constitution are, which would be numbers 11 through 27. I have gone on over there before. And by the way, you have 7 years to amend once it's introduced. 7 years to amend the Constitution. After 7 years, then that particular amendment dies. We've had several amendments that have been out there. Back during the 70s, it was called the Equal Rights Amendment, and it did not pass muster, and it just kind of died because it didn't get the necessary votes by the state legislatures. I would strongly suggest going over all of those particular amendments to the Constitution and be familiar with those for the Constitution test and for our true-false test will be coming up at midterm. I hope you have been studying your practice quizzes at the end of the chapter, and of course all of the defined and definition terms. I think that's so really important as we move forward. This concludes the second part of chapter 2, and we'll begin chapter 3 later on. Thank you.